General William Tecumseh Sherman is most famously known for his march to the sea in late autumn of 1864. However, his subsequent march through South Carolina and parts of North Carolina was far more destructive, a fact he acknowledged in his memoirs. Sherman commanded a regiment in the First Battle of Bull Run, a Union defeat that led him to suffer a bout of depression. Northern newspapers questioned his sanity, with one Cincinnati newspaper openly calling him insane. Sherman served under Ulysses S. Grant in Kentucky and Tennessee, including the bloody Battle of Shiloh at Pittsburgh Landing. He also participated in the campaign that led to the capture of Vicksburg, where he worked closely with U.S. Navy commanders operating on the Mississippi and Yazoo rivers. Despite his many military engagements, his capture of Atlanta, the subsequent destruction of the city, and his march through enemy territory to Savannah remain his most well-known and controversial achievements. Sherman's tactics have often been cited as the first episode of total war, targeting civilian populations and non-military infrastructure, a claim that is contested. He is famously misquoted as saying, "War is hell," a phrase that appeared in a northern newspaper after the Civil War. Sherman used similar tactics in military campaigns against Native American tribes in the West. Despite coming from a politically influential family, Sherman avoided politics himself. His brother John Sherman authored the Sherman Antitrust Act while serving as a U.S. Senator. William Tecumseh Sherman was one of the first Civil War generals to publish his memoirs, receiving great acclaim from literary critics and the public. Nonetheless, he is chiefly remembered for his campaign to make Georgia howl. Early life. William Tecumseh Sherman was born in 1820, the second son of Charles Robert Sherman, an Associate Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, and his wife Mary. He was named after the Shawnee warrior Tecumseh. The family lived in Lancaster, Ohio near the Shoto River, where Tecumseh had once exhorted Native American tribes to unite against American settlers. When Charles Sherman died unexpectedly during a typhoid epidemic in 1829, 9-year-old Sherman was taken in by Thomas Ewing, a prominent politician who later became the first Secretary of the Interior. There is some debate about Sherman's baptism, with some biographers claiming his foster parents baptized him as a Catholic, naming him William. However, others assert that he was baptized as a Presbyterian and named William Tecumseh Sherman from infancy. Regardless, he signed his name as W.T. Sherman for most of his life and was affectionately nicknamed Cump by friends and family. The Ewing family, who had a large family of their own, took in Sherman along with his widowed mother and 10 siblings, who remained in Lancaster with support from friends and extended family. Sherman excelled academically, particularly in mathematics, although he disliked the teasing he endured for his fiery red hair. His stepfather, then a U.S. Senator, secured an appointment for Sherman to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1836. At West Point, Sherman was indifferent to military appearance and discipline, accumulating numerous demerits. But he excelled in his classroom studies, graduating 6th in his class in 1840. He later claimed that his standing would have been higher if not for the demerits. Sherman was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery and saw his first action in the Second Seminole War in Florida, a conflict he later deemed unjust. He also served in South Carolina and Georgia, where he first observed the terrain of his later campaigns. During the Mexican War, Sherman did not see combat, instead being assigned to garrison duty in California. He spent 198 days at sea, sailing around Cape Horn before arriving in Monterey in 1847, where he drafted the Army reports confirming the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill. He married his stepsister, Ellen Boyle Ewing. The prominence of the Ewing family made their wedding a significant social event in Washington, attended by President Zachary Taylor, Vice President Millard Fillmore, and other notable figures. The Catholic wedding ceremony was conducted by Father James Ryder, the president of Georgetown College. Sherman agreed to raise their children in the Catholic faith, and they eventually had 8 children together, 4 girls and 4 boys. In his military career, Sherman was ordered to St. Louis to serve in the commissary department. By 1853, frustrated with the slow rate of promotion in the peacetime army, he resigned his commission and took a job as a bank manager in San Francisco. In 1857, he traveled again by sea to New York to manage a branch of the same bank there. However, a national economic downturn known as the Panic of 1857 led to the bank's failure in 1858. Sherman then joined a law firm owned by two of his brothers-in-law in Leavenworth, Kansas. Unsuccessful in practicing law, he accepted a teaching and administrative position as the superintendent of the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy, which later evolved into Louisiana State University. He was there when Louisiana seceded from the Union. In 1861, William Tecumseh Sherman resigned from his position and returned to St. Louis when Fort Sumter was bombarded by Southern troops. Despite his reservations about Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers, believing that the war would be prolonged and necessitate far more men, he offered his services to the Union. Sherman accepted a commission as a colonel of volunteers, commanding an infantry regiment. Sherman led his regiment in the First Battle of Bull Run, a disastrous defeat for the Union Army. However, his troops fought commendably during the engagement. Following this battle, Sherman was promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers and was ordered to the Western Theater in Kentucky, where he established his headquarters in Louisville in October 1861. In October 1861, Secretary of War Simon Cameron visited Sherman. Shortly after, reports criticizing Sherman's leadership abilities began to surface in northern newspapers. Sherman believed that war correspondents were undermining the Union war effort. In November, Sherman requested a leave of absence, and in December, his commander, Henry Halleck, granted him leave due to health reasons. Sherman suffered what was then termed a nervous breakdown, described by his wife as melancholy and insanity in a private letter. The newspapers reported Sherman's condition in a disparaging manner. Halleck, who had known Sherman since their days in California during the Mexican War, supported him during this difficult period. By late December, Sherman felt well enough to return to duty. Halleck assigned him to duties in the Western Theater. By March 1862, Sherman was commanding a division under Ulysses S. Grant. The Battle of Shiloh, which took place on April 6, 1862, cemented Sherman's reputation as a capable battlefield commander. On the first day, he successfully held the Union right in a fighting withdrawal. On the following day, he led a successful counterattack that resulted in a Union victory in what was then the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. This victory restored Sherman's peace of mind, prompting him to write to Grant that the single battle had given him new life. Later in 1862, Grant began a campaign to capture the Confederate stronghold at Vicksburg, Mississippi, and gain control of the Mississippi River. Sherman played a significant role in these operations, commanding a corps that comprised nearly half of Grant's army. The campaign was lengthy and complex, involving several Union repulses and persistent rumors in the press about Grant's drunkenness and Sherman's insanity. Despite these challenges, the Union forces succeeded after numerous dangerous maneuvers, coordination with the Navy, and a prolonged siege. Vicksburg surrendered to Grant's army on July 4, 1863, the same day Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia began its retreat from Gettysburg. Following the Union's campaign in eastern Tennessee, where Grant's forces captured Chattanooga and defeated the Confederate forces under Braxton Bragg, Sherman became one of Grant's most trusted subordinates. In early 1864, President Lincoln appointed Grant as commander of all Union forces. Grant chose to establish his headquarters in the field rather than in Washington, D.C., and assigned Sherman to oversee operations in the Western Theater. Before launching his campaign against Atlanta, Sherman had already developed his strategy for waging war in the Deep South. He wrote to Grant expressing confidence that if Grant could defeat Lee and he could march to the Atlantic, Old Uncle Abe, a reference to President Lincoln, would grant them a 20-day leave to see their families. Despite the somewhat derogatory reference to Lincoln, Sherman later included this remark in his memoirs. This letter marked the first known reference to his famous March to the Sea. In May 1864, as Grant engaged Lee in Virginia's wilderness, Sherman began his invasion of Georgia. Unlike Grant's approach of engaging in bloody battles in Virginia, Sherman employed a campaign of maneuver against Confederate General Joseph Johnston and later John Bell Hood, after Johnston was relieved. The Battle of Kennesaw Mountain was the only significant frontal assault ordered by Sherman during this campaign. Throughout the summer, the armies engaged in numerous skirmishes and major battles. After General John Bell Hood took command of the Confederate forces, Union troops gradually encircled Atlanta. Union General William T. Sherman occupied the city on September 2, 1864. Following a brief pursuit of Hood's army into Tennessee, Sherman returned to Atlanta in mid-November. He ordered civilians to evacuate the city and directed the destruction of all military and government property, including railroad facilities, depots, warehouses, rolling stock, locomotives, and maintenance buildings. This marked the beginning of his infamous March to the Sea, aimed at devastating Georgia. Traditionally, armies on the march sustained themselves by foraging from civilian land, sometimes paying for supplies, but often taking them forcibly. Sherman's 60,000 men were under strict orders not to loot private homes or harass non-hostile civilians. They were instructed to take necessary foodstuffs, horses, mules, and fodder, and then destroy anything of military value, including workshops, factories, railroads, wagons, bridges, boats, and other infrastructure that could support the war effort. The march proceeded in three major columns, each subdivided based on available roads, cutting a swath over 60 miles wide. Foraging parties branched out to confiscate supplies, while troops destroyed railroads by heating and twisting the rails, known as Sherman's neckties. As Sherman advanced, retreating Confederates employed scorched earth tactics, poisoning wells and burning crops. Despite some harassment by Confederate forces, Sherman's troops reached Savannah on December 10, 1864, where they faced 10,000 entrenched Confederates. After contacting the Union Navy, Sherman demanded the city surrender from Confederate commander William Hardee on December 17th. Hardee chose to escape rather than surrender, fleeing across the Savannah River. On December 21st, Sherman occupied the city. During the campaign, Sherman's army destroyed over 300 miles of railroads, seized over 9,000 horses and mules, 13,000 head of cattle, and freed more than 10,000 enslaved people. Sherman estimated the economic damage to the South at $100 million in 1864, nearly $1 billion today. Despite plans to transport his troops to join General Grant's forces in Virginia, Sherman convinced his superiors to allow him to march north through the Carolinas instead. After resting in Savannah for a few weeks, Sherman's army resumed their advance in South Carolina, considered the birthplace of secession. The destruction there far exceeded that in Georgia. Confederate forces abandoned Charleston, retreating northwest as Sherman advanced through difficult terrain, building corduroy roads and pontoon bridges. On February 17, 1865, Sherman captured Columbia, where fires ravaged the city due to the chaotic burning of cotton bales intended to prevent their capture by Union forces. The ensuing rioting, widespread drunkenness, and fires added to the city's devastation. Although Sherman directed firefighting efforts, the burning of Columbia remains controversial. Sherman's army covered 425 miles in 50 days, concluding their campaign with the surrender of Confederate General Joseph Johnston on April 18, 1865, just 9 days after General Robert E. Lee's surrender in Virginia. During this period, President Lincoln was assassinated, adding a somber note to the Union's military success. William T. Sherman was one of the first generals in history to implement the strategy of destroying an enemy's capacity to wage war, rather than focusing solely on defeating its armies in battle. He correctly reasoned that by targeting infrastructure, food supplies, and civilian morale, support for the enemy's military would diminish, leading to desertion, starvation, and sickness within the army. This approach proved effective as evidenced by General Johnston's surrender to Sherman, with just 13,000 men remaining from his once larger force, which had largely dissipated. Sherman began the Civil War without command or combat experience, and was initially uncertain of his abilities. However, he concluded the war as a highly respected strategist, known for his stern discipline and genuine concern for his troops' well-being. After the Civil War, William Tecumseh Sherman chose to remain in the Army. In 1869, when Ulysses S. Grant became president, Sherman was appointed commanding general of the United States Army. He held this position during the Indian Wars, a period that coincided with the westward expansion of the railroads. The railroads disrupted the migration paths of the bison, which were crucial to the livelihoods of many Western tribes. The U.S. Army was tasked with protecting the railroads and the settlers moving west under the Homestead Act, leading to conflicts with Native American tribes. Both sides committed numerous atrocities, although there is no evidence that Sherman ever said, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." However, he did advocate for total war against the tribes. During the Great Sioux War, Sherman wrote to President Grant, urging a relentless campaign against the Sioux, even to the point of extermination. Sherman believed that the Plains Indians could not sustain their way of life without the bison, which were essential for food, tools, clothing, and shelter. He became an early advocate for the eradication of the bison, supporting the massive hunts organized by railroads and other entities. This rapid destruction of the bison herds led to Congress passing a law in 1874 to protect them from overhunting, but Sherman convinced President Grant to veto its enforcement. Ultimately, the decimation of the bison forced the Plains Indians to abandon their traditional lifestyle and move to reservations. In 1875, Sherman published his memoirs, focusing primarily on his Civil War experiences and including criticisms of his former commander, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant responded positively to the memoirs, which became one of the earliest and most acclaimed Civil War accounts. Sherman resigned as commanding general in 1883, retired in 1884, and moved to New York City, where he became a popular public figure. He declined to run for president in 1884, famously stating that he would not serve if elected. Sherman lived in New York until his death from pneumonia in February 1891. His old adversary, Joseph Johnston, served as an honorary pallbearer at his funeral, braving the cold without a hat out of respect, and died of pneumonia a month later. Sherman remains a controversial figure, admired for his military prowess, but criticized for his scorched earth tactics. Despite his harsh methods in war, he offered generous peace terms and supported the rights of freed slaves, advocating for land ownership and civil rights for blacks in the South. Southern historians of the Lost Cause movement vilified Sherman as a brutal contrast to the genteel Robert E. Lee. However, Sherman's principles of warfare, emphasizing the total destruction of the enemy's war-making capabilities, influenced later military strategies, including those in World War II and Vietnam. Sherman believed that the Civil War, despite its immense cost in lives and treasure, was justified by the abolition of slavery, making the nation better as a whole. Whether his actions increased or reduced the war's overall cost remains a subject of debate among historians and military scholars.